This is CLAS Chats, brief video interviews featuring 10 questions that focus on the experience and work of students affiliated with the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago. I'm your host, Natalie Arsenault, Associate Director of CLAS.
Hi, my name is Isabela Fraga, and I am a PhD student in Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian Studies at the Romance Languages Department, and I work on cultures of slavery in late 18th, 19th century Latin America, and specifically on Brazil and Cuba. So I was born and raised in Brazil, and I did my bachelor's and my master's degree there. And Brazil is a country that has a kind of a weird relationship with the rest of Latin America. So honestly, what actually drew me to Latin American studies was living Brazil and coming to the US. So I think the distance, both geographical and also like emotional distance from Brazil, and the fact that I was here in the headquarters of the American Empire kind of made me think of Brazil as being part of Latin America and not part of Latin America at the same time. So I could see some of possible connections and interactions and articulations between Brazil and the rest of the continent that I hadn't noticed before. Okay, this is a tricky question because there are many people in my committee involved in this. But I think I can say that the course that I took with Professor Larissa Brio Garcia, I think it was 2018, and I think it was called Empire, Slavery, and Salvation, Writing Difference in the Iberian Atlantic. And it's not really my period of study, but it was really amazing to kind of dive into colonial sources and colonial texts that I think really shape the way I understand issues of race and bodily difference in my own work, which deals more with the 19th century. The two books I think have been foundational in my work in Latin American studies are Julio Ramos' Desencuentros de la Modernidad en América Latina, which was translated as Divergent Modernities, and it examines 19th century more canonic writers from Argentina to Cuba. And the other is Pablo Gomez's Exploration Caribbean, Creating Knowledge and Healing in the Early Modern Atlantic. And again, even though it's not the precise period of study with which I work on, I find myself going back to it again and again because I think it's such an interesting and refreshing approach to colonial archives in Latin America. And it also examines the role of Black ritual practitioners in the Spanish Caribbean and how they developed what he calls an experientially based knowledge about the body, about nature, and about illnesses. And these knowledges produced by these Black ritual practitioners were at the same time independent from and also in articulation with some other European-based knowledges. So I really find that book really interesting. First of all, I think the workshop on Latin America and the Caribbean, which I co-coordinated in 2017, I think. It was really an incredible space to learn and keep learning about many other different fields across the humanities and social sciences that address Latin American issues. I also received a Tinker Field Research grant in my first 2 years here, which allowed me to go to Cuba and then to Bahia in Brazil and to do some preliminary research for my dissertation. And these two trips were like fundamental, crucial for my project. And not only because of what I found during these trips, but also because of the experience with archival research, which is something that I found I really, really love doing, even though it can be really frustrating. And actually, finally, but it's not the least important thing, I really enjoyed the lunchtime talks about current issues in Latin America, not only for the food, but even though the food was great, it was also because it was a really a way of understanding current issues in other Latin American countries that I wasn't that familiar with. I think it started to come together when I was doing research at the Cuban National Library for the first time in 2017. And I came across this 19th century bulletin issued by an insurance company. And it called my attention because it was a slave insurance company. And I knew I wanted to study slavery in Cuba, but at that point I had no idea that there was such a thing as slave insurance companies in Cuba or anywhere in Latin America. But most of all, what called my attention in this was that there was a list in the end of the bulletin of all the enslaved peoples who had died in the previous months, and there was like the cause of death of each of them. And two of them had died of nostalgia. So I was very intrigued by that, because then I came to understand it was an illness that afflicted Africans, enslaved Africans. So they kind of opened the door to understanding how people conceived the mind of the enslaved at that point in the late 18th and 19th century, Cuba and Brazil. In my dissertation, I look into the different ways in which conceptions of feeling or affect played a role within cultures of slavery, and also in the processes of emancipation in Brazil and Cuba from the late 18th century to the late 19th century. And by feeling, I mean being able or unable to feel, feeling too much or feeling too little. So the gradations in feeling, right? And particularly, I examined texts by slavers and formerly enslaved peoples written during the expansion of the slave trade, and also through the aftermath of abolition in Brazil and Cuba. And I tried to show how central feeling and affect was in discourses on the humanity of the enslaved. So I work with medical, literary, and anthropological discourses to show that feeling informed theories and practices of slave management and racialized care, as much as it also inspired the sentimental accounts on the horrors of slavery, with which I think many of us are familiar. So there hasn't been any major change or turn in my project, but it's more of like a continuous process of delineating the issues that I want to work with, or the issues that I think are important to work with, and to turn something that it used to be like more of a blurred image, like a vague idea, into something that I think is more a defined silhouette or a more defined outline, and hopefully in the end something a more well-defined image. I think my work aims at reconstructing a genealogy of an imagined Black affect that has informed legislation, public policies, and policing practices all over the Atlantic world. So, for example, many of the texts that I'm working with are basically white scientists and intellectuals trying to decide if enslaved peoples or free people of color felt more or less emotional pain than whites, or if they were more inclined to become criminals. This was more towards the late 19th century. So even though most of these theories have been debunked, right, especially by movements for Black liberation, it still somehow informs much of the contemporary statistics that we see of police violence, mass incarceration, and racialized medical care that people of color still endure throughout the Americas, not only in Brazil and Cuba. And I think if I can add to that, I think the second way I think my research connects to more global issues is that I hope that it also shows some ways in which Afro-descendants themselves have refuted these ideas of white superiority by appropriating and repurposing some rhetorical tools that were denied to them, such as sensibility, for example, right? It is the center of my project. Sometimes when you're looking through the archives, you see glimpses of like everyday life that, for me at least, are hilarious. So once when I was doing research at the Instituto de Literatura y Lingüística in Havana, I was looking through this classified ad section of this 1844 edition of a newspaper called Diario de la Marina. And there I found an ad of somebody looking for, quote, right, very talkative large parrots that they had lost. And the one thing they mentioned to identify the lost bird, because they were trying to get it back, was that it had favorite words, and the favorite sentence that the parrot had was, "Yo no quiero ir a la escuela," so I don't want to go to school. So I just stared at that ad, just imagining this family who had a kid who was complaining every day about not wanting to go to school, and the parrots just picked it up and just started yelling to the whole neighborhood, "No quiero ir a la escuela, no quiero ir a la escuela." And I don't know, maybe somebody got annoyed at the parrot and just stole the parrot, or maybe the parrot got fed up with the kid and fled. I don't know. I just think those little glimpses of life are really funny, to me at least. It has to be Bahia in Brazil. So any place in Bahia, it could be Salvador, it could be the Recôncavo Baiano, anywhere actually. And my reasons for this are the most cliche ones. It's beautiful, the food is great, people are great, it has a very interesting history. And I really don't have more to add to that.
The University of Chicago has a long-standing commitment to and tolerance of multiple forms of free expression. Opinions expressed by guests on class chats do not reflect the official position of the university or any of its constituent departments or organizations. Thanks for watching.